Hello everybody, welcome to the city of Meßkirch. I'm standing right now in the center of the town. It is of course the place where Martin Heidegger was born on September 26, 1889. Today the city of Meßkirch has a population of around 8,500 people. The name was first mentioned in the Vita of Saint Imrad in 965. At the beginning of the 14th century, the Trugsessen van Benzenberg moved their residence to Meßkirch, and from then on, Meßkirch grew and became an important market city and also a residence. The name Meßkirch originally comes from Meßkirch, Mass Church. It was originally a church where Mass was celebrated. In the early Middle Ages, there were not many priests, and a lot of churches would be dependent on monks to travel there from the many monasteries that were scattered around Germany. And they would come there every week or every 2 weeks to celebrate Mass with the people who lived near the church. Meßkirch grew into a lively city, but slowly faded away at the beginning of the 19th century, and today it's not as important as it used to be, but it still is home to many of the interesting sites from Heidegger's early years as a boy and also as a student of theology. I'm standing here next to a building that played a major role in Heidegger's youth. This is the place where he was baptized. I will tell you the story and the reason why he was baptized here and not in the St. Martin's Church, where his father was sexton. In 1870, the dogma of the infallibility of the Pope was proclaimed. For many Roman Catholics, this was not acceptable, and they decided to regroup under the name Old Catholics. Old meaning here, going back to the church before this 1870 dogma. In Meßkirch, the community of Old Catholics grew pretty fast, and it consisted mainly of the better classes of society. And for that reason, in 1875, the city decided to give the Old Catholics the right to also use the Roman Catholic Church dedicated to Saint Martin, which was, of course, for the Roman Catholics not acceptable. And for them, it was like a desecration of their church. For that reason, they moved out. The city priest bought the building we're standing next to, and it was transformed into an emergency church. It was decorated and with help of monks from the nearby monastery of Boiron, which were famous for their own new form of art. In this church, this emergency church, Heidegger was baptized. In 1895, the number of Old Catholics had gone down so much that the decision was taken to return the St. Martin's Church to the Roman Catholics. And then Heidegger and his family, meaning him and his brother Fritz and his sister Maria, moved into the house that was provided by the church for the sexton. In this building, at the end behind me, Heidegger's father had his workshop. He was not only sexton, but also a cooper master, and he would make his barrels in the workshop. Of course, young Martin Heidegger as a boy would be spending quite some time there, also helping his father. They would go out to the Eenried forest that is on the Veldweg, where they would collect wood for his father to make barrels. And you find traces of this experience of the workshop in Being and Time, where Heidegger talks about equipment, Zeug, and tells the famous story of the hammer that we only notice when the hammer is too light or too heavy for the job to be done. And he also explains that every piece of equipment finds its own place and reason for being in the context of the workshop. Here we are at the so-called Sextons House. It's the house provided for the sexton of the St. Martin Church, which I'm looking at straight ahead of me. And it was put at the disposal of the sexton and his family to live there. Martin Heidegger and his father and mother, his brother Fritz and his sister Maria lived in this house from 1895 until the death of his mother in 1927. Heidegger's father passed away in 1925, but due to his obligations in Marburg, Heidegger couldn't return in time to Meßkirch to see his father before his death. In 1927, in spring, his mother passed away, but Heidegger was in time to see his mother before she died, and he could present her with a fresh copy of Being in Time on a deathbed as a kind of proof that although he didn't become a priest, his life had turned out all right, and he had found a meaningful way of living his life and also contributing to the well-being of human beings through his philosophy. I'm standing here next to a fountain and in front of a building that used to be the old schoolhouse. And this was the school that Martin Heidegger went to as a boy. Since he was the best of his class and a very intelligent boy, the priest of the city decided to give Heidegger private lessons in Latin. Because without knowledge of Latin, he would not be able to enter a gymnasium as a preparation for later studies of theology. This, of course, the ultimate goal of becoming a priest. So when Heidegger set out on his path of education, the goal was to become a priest. That's also the reason why he got endowments from the Catholic Church to finance his studies. Next to me, on the left, on my left side, is the fountain. And that fountain was already there when this building was still the schoolhouse. It was later transformed into an old people's home. When Martin Heidegger and his brother Fritz would have helped their father with his barrel making, they were allowed to take the bark from the wood that they had collected at the Ainreed forest and use that to carve little ships. And these little ships they would play with, among other places, here in this fountain, as Heidegger mentions also in his famous little text, the Veldweg. I'm standing here at the heart of Meßkirch in front of the city hall, or das Rathaus. This building was built in 1899, which means at the time when Martin Heidegger was 10 years old. It has a beautiful town hall inside of it, and here the celebrations took place when Heidegger received the honorary citizenship of the city of Meßkirch. Also, it was the place where his brother Fritz, during Carnival, would give his roast, and where I'm standing now, it would be full with people who were all eager to hear what jokes Fritz was going to make about their fellow citizens this time. They would speak from the balcony and address the crowd. I'm standing in front of the Schloss, the castle of Meßkirch. It dates back to around 1400, but it was renovated and turned into a Renaissance castle in the middle of the 16th century. It is also home to a very large ballroom, 31 meters long, with beautiful Renaissance wooden covered ceiling, which is also the first and biggest one north of the Alps. It now houses not only the Heidegger Museum, which is on this side of me, but it is also home to the Martin Heidegger-Archiv. We will be visiting the archive and the museum later, and then I will tell more about it. But it's of course a place that Heidegger knew very well, because it's very close to the home where he grew up in, and it's also close to his school, as you will probably also see later. We are now inside the Martin Heidegger-Archiv in the castle of Meßkirch. The archive dates back basically to the early 50s, when a civil servant of the town hall in Meßkirch, Friedrich Hermann, started collecting newspaper clippings and books about and of Heidegger. Since visiting professors would be welcomed by him and he would take them on a tour of Meßkirch, he could ask them if they would be as kind to make some of their publications available to his small but growing archive. For many years it was located in a room in the town hall, but when the castle was renovated, they decided to create a real archive here in the castle. I'm standing now in one of the rooms. Behind me you see the bookcases that contain basically the books of Fritz Heidegger, which he had at his home. There are some which have marginalia of Martin Heidegger. There are some dedicated copies of books that Martin gave to his brother. Here we decided to build the archive as an archive of photos and film recordings and things like that. So we have collected over the last 20 years a large collection of more than 1,200 photos of basically all the documentaries that were done about Heidegger in English and German. I also started doing interviews with people who knew Heidegger still personally, like both his sons, Hermann and Jörg, his nephew, Heinrich Heidegger, who was also a priest, and former students of Heidegger like Rainer Martin, for example, and Walter Biemel. We also are collecting recordings of Heidegger. Heidegger made a special series of recordings for the son of one of his oldest and best friends, Bruno Leiner. His son had been wounded in the Second World War and could not attend university and could not attend Heidegger's presentations. For that reason, Heidegger recorded for him about 6 of his conferences on a tape recorder. We've been fortunate enough to get hold of the tapes. We are digitalizing everything over time. So we're trying to preserve as much as we can the heritage of Heidegger as far as film, photo, and recordings are concerned. One other special gift we have here are the stones that Martin Heidegger wrote the text of the Art and Space, the Kunst und der Raum, upon, which was part of this project he did with Chillida, the famous Basque sculptor, who made lithos to go with the book. It's the only joint publication of Martin Heidegger in his life. And we have these stones here. And if you ever come to Meßkirch in the archive, you can see them in real life, which is of course a strange thing to say about stones, but there are 2 or 3 exhibited in the museum, so anytime you come to Meßkirch, you can see them. Welcome to the Martin Heidegger Museum of the city of Meßkirch. It was opened on September 26, 2002. We're now standing in one of the 2 main rooms. The museum also has a hallway where there are items exhibited. Here I'm standing next to a photo of Heidegger's cabin in Tautenberg, where he's standing close to the beam that collects the water that he uses both for washing and for drinking. It's a source that springs from in the Black Forest, and you can drink the water. Next to me you also see one of the different Sternwürfel, or the stars, that were put on what they call the Brunnenstock, which is the wooden vertical piece through which the water runs and then falls into the beam. There were about 6 or 7 different stars over the years, because they will start to rot and fall apart over time because they're exhibited to the climate, and it can be pretty hot and pretty cold in Doudnaberg. But this is one of the original ones, and we're very pleased that we have it here in our exhibition. You can also see the poem next to me that Paul Celan wrote a few days after he had visited Martin Heidegger in the cabin Augentrost. You can look it up. It's a beautiful poem, and it's been discussed in many different ways. Behind me you can see what is called in Meßkirch the Philosopher Terminal, which means in English the little tower of the philosopher. There's an interesting story behind it. In 1938, Martin Heidegger started moving his manuscripts from Freiburg to Meßkirch. He was aware of the possibility of war coming soon, and Freiburg is of course on the French border, and he was afraid that his manuscripts might be destroyed during a bombing attack, for example. He brought them to Meßkirch and gave them to his brother Fritz for safekeeping. Fritz at that time was working at the local Volksbank, or the Popular Bank, where he had the possibility of typing manuscripts. So in the weekends, Fritz would take his typewriter with him to his home and started typing the manuscripts of his brother. The first one that he did was the fresh one that Heidegger had just finished, the famous contributions to philosophy, or in German, Beiträge zur Philosophie. In the late fall of 1944, the decision was taken to move the philosophy department of the University of Freiburg from Freiburg to Burg Wildenstein. Burg Wildenstein is a castle overlooking the Danube Valley, close to Boiron, where the famous monastery, Benedictine monastery, is also. This was the reason that Heidegger spent a lot of time in the winter of 1944, either in Meßkirch or close to Burg Wildenstein in the forest house of Schlosshausen. But late in 1944, Meßkirch was bombed, and the bank where Heidegger kept his manuscript safe in a safe caught fire. So he and his brother Fritz went to the bank, climbed through the window, and managed to get Heidegger's manuscript out in time before the whole building burned down. So with a bit of luck, the Gesamtausgabe, you could say, was saved. I'm standing here in the so-called Hoof Garden, or the garden of the castle. In the heydays of the castle, it was of course closed off to the general public, and only the aristocratic family that lived at the castle could go here around for walks, and they also grew vegetables here. When Martin Heidegger was a schoolboy, he would come here to play with his friends and probably play hide and seek and things like that. As he got a bit older and was a student of theology at the University of Freiburg, he would come here and spend a lot of time in the summers in Meßkirch, and he would find a nice place in the shade where he could read the works of the great philosophers he was working on at the time. One of the books may have been the famous dissertation of Franz Brentano on the manifold meanings of being in Aristotle. Heidegger later claimed that this work was his introduction to philosophy and the beginning of his lifelong quest for an answer to the question on the sense of being. The trees you can see here, the old linden trees, are still the same that were here when Martin Heidegger was sitting here in the shade, trying to make sense of philosophical texts. Behind me you can see the grave of Martin Heidegger. He was laid to rest here on May 28th, after he had passed away on the 26th in Freiburg. It is a family grave, so Heidegger is not here all alone by himself, but also his wife, Frida, found no resting place here, and his brother, his wife, Friedrich, Fritz, Elizabeth, and his parents, Friedrich and Johanna. also counted on resting place here. After his stroke in January 1970, Heidegger never fully recovered. And in the winter of 1975-76, he began to feel the shadow of death over his shoulder. And for that reason, he invited both his nephew, Heidegger, who was a priest, and his friend, Bernhard Welpe, who was, like Heidegger, also from Meßkirch. His father had been the chef de clinique of the hospital that Meßkirch still had in those years. As you may notice, or you will be able to see later, the tombstones of his father and mother, his brother and his wife, have crosses on them. But Martin Heidegger's grave is adorned by a star. Many people have been asking why a star. There is a good reason, I think, and it's explainable. I just want to cite from Heidegger's little book, Alfred Denker, which is in English called The Thinker's Poet. And I'm going to put my glasses if I want to read, bear with me. In that little book there's a line that runs, I'll read in German first and then the English translation. Denken ist die Einschränkung einiger Sachen, der einst wie ein Stern im Himmel der Welt stehen bleibt. So, to think is to confine yourself to a think of thought that one day stands still like a star in the sky. In another line, Heidegger says, auf einen Stern zu gehen. To have towards a star, only this. You may remember that Heidegger often said that every philosopher only thought one thought, that his thinking is the explication of this one thing. If in Heidegger's case this one thought is the question of the meaning of being, then the star symbols the whole of the thinking. It stands still in the sky as a star.